cameras off if you are not presenting. That way, the algorithm of Zoom allows the speaker's camera to be the one that people will display, will be seeing by default. So to start off this afternoon's session, we have sort of readjusted the order a bit, but our first guest speaker is currently the Director for Investment Policy and Planning Service of the Board of Investments. She has been so since 2019 and has been the officer in charge for the Financial and Administrative Service of the Board of Investments since 2018. She graduated from the University of Antwerp, Belgium as cum laude, and she was there from the years 2000 to 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Director Sandra Marie Santos Recolizado, the Director for Investment Policy and Planning of the Board of Investments. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Sir Darwin. Good afternoon, everyone. So can we start? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present the Strategic Investment Priorities Plan as provided under CREATE. So next slide, please. So basically, what does the CREATE law says on what should be in the SIPP? So we enumerated all the provisions under CREATE, specifying what should be included in the SIPP, and these are number one, overall, I think provision is that the BOI shall formulate the SIPP, but this should be in coordination with the FIRB, the other investment promotion agencies, other government agencies administering tax incentives, and the private sector. And the IPA shall not accept any applications unless the activity is listed in the SIPP. So it also provides that the SIPP shall contain the following. Priority projects included in the Philippine Development Plan or its equivalent as provided under Section 300A. The scope and coverage of location and industry tiering, Section 300B. The terms and conditions on the grant of the enhanced deduction. So this is Section 300C, taking into consideration Section 295. Section 295 enumerated what are the different kinds of enhanced deduction. And then it also states that the qualifications of the following projects to register under CREATE should also be in the SIPP. So what are these? The qualified expansion or entirely new project or activity to be registered under CREATE. So these are the new expansion or new projects. So to differentiate from the existing projects, because there is a separate, it also identified existing registered projects as may qualify as one of those projects that may qualify to register under CREATE. And then it also specifies that the SIPP should also contain the qualifications or the conditions for an existing registered export enterprise to be able to apply or avail of the incentives under CREATE. So how should the existing export enterprises avail of the incentives under CREATE, especially the SIT? So that should, those are the things that should be in the SIPP. And then next slide, please. Additional things are that the SIPP should also identify the non-fiscal support that would help create a pool of high-skilled jobs for certain enterprises or industry. And then the period of availment. So to differentiate from what is now being implemented in the BOI, it's either the date of the date of registration or the date of the start of commercial operation as stated in the application form. So that is usually where we base the start of the incentives. But here under create, the start of the period of availment shall commence from the start of commercial operation unless otherwise provided in the SIPP. So the SIPP can also dictate when will the start of commercial operation be considered for certain activities. So this one we also have to study. Next is that it also provides that all sectors or industries that may be included in the SIPP shall undergo an evaluation process. So we cannot include any activity or sectors in the SIPP unless it is supported by a formal evaluation process. So very strict po siya. So next slide, please. What are in the SIPP? Under the SIPP, Section 300, the parameters to be considered are it should have a substantial amount of investments. The activity should be able to generate employment, considerable employment. That was the term used in the law. And then it should also be able to generate considerable amount of net export. So it's just not export, it should be net export. So for that industry, for that particular industry, what would be considered would be the exports minus imports to get the net exports. Then another parameter for consideration is the use of modern, advanced, or new technology. Then another consideration is the processes and innovations that will lead towards the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, which shall include but will not be limited to adoption of adequate environmental protection systems and sustainability strategies. So next slide, please. Another parameter or consideration is that the project or the industry or activity will help in addressing missing links or industry gaps or supply or value chain gaps, or it can help the industry in moving up the value chain or product ladder. Then another consideration is that it can help in the promotion of market competitiveness. Next is that it can enhance the industry or the activity can enhance the capabilities of Filipino enterprises and professionals to produce and offer increasingly sophisticated products and services. Then the ninth consideration is that it can contribute to the Philippine food security and increased incomes in the agriculture and fisheries sector. Last consideration is that services and activities that can promote regional and global operations in the country. So we have 10 parameters or considerations, and the activity or the industry should be able to meet or satisfy any of these parameters to be included in the SIPP. So next, the SIPP also provides for the tiering of the industry. So basically, there are 2 steps for the formulation of the SIPP. First, we have to identify what are the industries that should be included in the SIPP that will satisfy any of the 10 parameters enumerated earlier on. Then the next step would be to categorize these activities into that tier that they will to determine the set of incentives that they can avail. So if an industry is will satisfy, for example, the criteria for tier 1, then it will be categorized under tier 1. So for the tiering of the industries, the requirement to be considered under tier 1 is that it should have high potential for job creation. Um, or these are the sectors with market failures resulting in under provision of basic goods and services. So basically, this is related to addressing supply or value chain gaps. Then value creation through innovation, upgrading, moving up the value chain. Then essential support to sectors critical to industrial development. And last is emerging owing to, it's an emerging sector or industry or activity owing to potential comparative advantage of the Philippines. The second tier basically is for the production of raw materials and supply and intermediate products that are not locally produced here in the Philippines or not in sufficient uh, quantity or locally produced but not in sufficient quantity and are critical to our industrial development, or these products or this activity will produce products that are that can replace what we are importing, so import substituting activities. Then the third tier, basically this is to promote or to encourage more innovation and development, R&D. So the third tier, which will provide the most incentive package for activities, will cover those that will engage in R&D with significant value added, higher productivity, breakthroughs in science and health, and that will provide high-paying jobs. And then next is that it should generate new knowledge and IP registered or licensed in the Philippines. And then it also will cover those projects or activities that will commercialize patents, industrial designs, copyrights, and utility models, because we do have patents, products and services that are patented, but the commercialization of these patents are very, very small. So this is one way to encourage commercialization of our Filipino innovations. Then we have the highly technical manufacturing, and last is the critical to structural transformation of the economy. So activities critical to structural transformation. So next slide, please. Incentives entitlement will depend on the location of the activity and the industry tier where the activity is categorized. So for export market activities, incentives will range. For example, the income tax holiday will range from 4 years to 7 years. So 4 years will be the basic or the minimum ITH that can be availed if you are locating under NCR, in the NCR, National Capital Region, and your project is categorized under Tier 1. And then it can go up to 6 years income tax holiday if the project is categorized under Tier 3, if you are located in NCR. So, but if the project is locating in areas that are contiguous or adjacent to NCR or in other metropolitan areas, which are identified as Cebu and Davao as of now by the CREATE law, the income tax holiday will be 5 years up to 7 years, depending on the industry tier. And then for all other areas, so that will be beyond those adjacent to NCR, uh, you can get from 6 years to 7 years. So the further you are from NCR, the more income tax holiday that the project will get. Then if you will notice, for export activities, the enhanced deduction and the SIT is 10 years. And the project will get to choose on whether it will avail of the enhanced deduction or the SIT. For the domestic market activities, the entitlement to ITH is also from 4 years to 7 years, again, depending on the location and the industry tier. But the difference is that there is no SIT. The domestic market activities are not entitled to SIT, and their entitlement to enhanced deduction is limited only to 5 years. So that's the difference if you are export-oriented or if you are domestic-oriented. So next slide, please. This slide shows the menu of incentives that are available for qualified projects under the SIPP. So 4 to 7 years income tax holiday, 5% special corporate income tax or SCIT. Then enhanced deduction. The enhanced deductions are shown on the right-hand side of the screen. So these are the depreciation allowance of assets, the additional 10% for buildings, additional 20% for machineries and equipment. Then we have the 50% additional deduction on labor expense, 100% additional deduction on R&D, then 100% additional deduction on training expense, 50% deduction on domestic input expense, 50% additional deduction on power expense, and deduction for investment allowance. Then we also have the enhanced NOLCO, but I think it's not shown here. So and then next, we have duty exemption on importation of capital equipment, raw materials, spare parts, or accessories. Then there is VAT exemption on importation and VAT zero rating on local purchases. Next, please. Certain terms were also defined in the CREATE that is critical, that will be critical in the formulation of the SIPP, given that these terms were used in the parameters or in the industry tiering. So domestic market enterprises are enterprises registered with IPAs other than export enterprise. And then export enterprise refers to those that can export 70% of its total production or output. Then, as mentioned earlier, metropolitan areas refer to Cebu or Davao. And then there is this flexibility that the NEDA can further identify other metropolitan areas. Then sophisticated and sophistication related definition, it relates to the parameter earlier mentioned, wherein the process or the innovation will lead towards more sophisticated products or services. So sophisticated and sophistication were defined by the law to refer to the state when a product or service requires a high level of technology, human capital, competencies, or know-how, and infrastructure to be produced or offered. So that's it. So next. And then what are the sustainable development goals? Again, it relates to the parameters enumerated by the law, those processes and innovations that will support the SDG. So these are the SDGs that, that can be considered relative to the innovations and processes that will be assessed. So next slide, please. So what are we doing now? The BOI has met with the other investment promotion agencies. We now have the technical working group, the PIPP, because we have this committee of IPAs. It's called PIPP, and we have already created the technical working group with the PIPP members, and we have started discussing the parameters and considering analytical tools and metrics that we can use in order to assess whether an activity can be considered as contributing to considerable investments or contributing considerable employment or contributing considerable net export. So when we talk about parameters for SIPP, we are talking about industry data, not just company data. Given the complexity of formulating the SIPP, considering the parameters and the industry tiering involved, the BOI has proposed that the 2020 IPP be considered as the interim SIPP, and the FIRB board, during its first meeting under the CREATE law last Wednesday, April 14, approved the adoption of the 2020 IPP as the interim SIPP. So we are just now waiting for the FIRB resolution so that we can share this with the interested parties and perhaps post this in our website for the information of our investors and businessmen. And then we would also like to consider including in the SIPP the areas or sectors under the Rebuild Philippines. Rebuild Philippines is the recovery strategy of the DTI. But of course, they have to meet the parameters enumerated in the CREATE law under Section 300. So we would also, if you noted, some of the parameters enumerated under Section 300 cannot be quantified, like what is modern, what is new technology, what is innovation, or what can contribute to the structural transformation of the economy. So all those things will be difficult to quantify. So we have identified, together with the other investment promotion agencies under the technical working group, we have identified the parameters that we consider to be not quantifiable, and we have agreed to conduct an expert group consultations for these parameters. So now we are in our next meeting, we will be discussing or identifying who will be the experts that we will be inviting for each particular parameter, and how to approach the expert group discussion or consultation. And then we have already a calendar of activities agreed on, and the target is to have the draft SIPP presented to the steering committee under CREATE for approval. So the steering committee will be chaired by the BOI with FIRB as one of its members. Of course, the other members will be the IPAs and the other government agencies that are involved with tax. And as mentioned by the Undersecretary, the target is to have the final IPP issued by November of this year. So it will be a long process for us, and until now we are still identifying the metrics or the analytical tools to represent what is the intention of each parameter of the CREATE, or to measure or assess, to help us measure or assess the parameters enumerated under CREATE. So part of the approach also will be the conduct of public hearing once we have the draft list already. So next slide, please. Okay, that's the last slide, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Sandra, and thank you again for that presentation on the SIPP. To continue with our program, our next guest is the Director of the Legal and Compliance Service of the Board of Investments. And as Director of the BOI LCS, she leads the BOI legal team, handling all legal matters, providing legal opinion and support for all BOI services, as well as to draft bills and resolutions regarding trade and investments for the Philippine Senate and the House of Representatives. She represents the BOI before judicial and quasi-judicial bodies and serves as the Philippine lead in investment agreement chapter negotiations for regional and bilateral free trade agreements. She oversees the compliance division of the BOI, which handles supervision and monitoring of BOI registered business enterprises, as well as their compliance with their respective terms and conditions, including evaluations of requests for amendment of the said terms and conditions, as well as the conduct of ocular inspections relating to their compliance with the same. Prior to becoming director of the BOI LCS, she was an attorney for the said agency for 10 years and has had experience as an intellectual property lawyer for the private sector. In her early professional years, she was elected as municipal councilor in the local legislature of her hometown in Banisilan, Cotabato from 2001 to 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, Attorney Ellie Jean Partosa.
Thank you very much, Darwin. I think the introduction is longer than the time that I'm gonna take for my presentation, because practically Director Sandy has already highlighted the things that we should know about CREATE. But nonetheless, thank you, Darwin, for the kind introduction. Again, good afternoon to everyone. Okay, my PowerPoint basically provides for the highlights of what's in CREATE, but maybe later on we will try to focus on certain specifics, the things that we are also taking into consideration in the drafting of the IRR and others. And of course, later on in the question and answer, we will be very interested to have that question and answer segment later. Okay, so we can start next slide. Okay, so I'm not sure. Okay, Director Sandy had mentioned earlier, CREATE took effect on April 11, 2021. So there are things in EO 226 that were repealed, some powers that were transferred to the Fiscal Incentives Review Boards. I will highlight that later, because I think our participants would be interested also as to the process. Both the substantial and the procedural processes that will be changed with CREATE. Okay, so next slide. So incentives. Okay, so basically CREATE will cover all the investment promotion agencies. It provides for the menu of incentives that is uniform. If you notice, if everyone knows here that prior to CREATE, there are several the incentive package that's being administered by the different investment promotion agencies, PESA, BOI, AFA, etc., would vary because the special laws creating them would provide for the incentives. So, but with CREATE, there's one menu that will be administered by all the investment promotion agencies. In terms of approval of disapproval of incentives, our process is that our prospective investor will go to the investment promotion agency concerned, and then that's where they will file their application for registration. And then the concerned investment promotion agency will evaluate the application, and for projects with investment capital of more than 1 billion, the approval or disapproval of the incentives would be with the Fiscal Incentives Review Board. So the Fiscal Incentives Review Board, or the FIRB, is co-chaired by the Secretaries of Trade and the Secretary of Secretary of Trade and Secretary of Finance. And the members there are the Executive Secretary from the Office of the President, the Secretary of DBM, and the NEDA Secretary. So it's the FIRB that's going to make a decision on the incentive for those projects with more than 1 billion. For those projects with investment capital of 1 billion and below, that will be within the powers of the concerned IPA. Okay, so in terms of the period to process all of these things, the processes of the FIRB will be covered by our timelines under the EODB law, which is basically, that's okay, which is because we're taking into account also the veto message of the president on CREATE. So this menu of incentives were practically were already discussed by Director Sandy. So we'll skip this. Next slide. Okay. So also this formulation of the SIPP is with the BOI, and Director Sandy also discussed the conditions or qualifications for a project to be qualified either under tier 1, tier 2, or 3. And she also mentioned that the farther you are from NCR, the longer the incentives under tier 8. So we would want to also encourage location of activities in the countryside. So for example, for a manufacturing activity, or like the membership of HIMAP, providing for services, so it could be qualified as an export. The ITH would be from 4 to 7 years, but depending on location. So if the said activity is classified under tier 1 and it's located in NCR, that is 4 years of ITH. But for the same activity that will locate, for example, in Mindanao or in North Cotabato, where I came from, then that would be entitled to 6 years of ITH for the same activity. So that's how the CREATE would work. Okay, so we can skip this slide. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Okay, period of availment, as already mentioned by Director Sandy, this is up to 17 years for export and up to 12 years for the domestic market activities. The conditions for, let's say, enhanced deductions, because we have several there, basically our incentive would already place in the Philippines in a very competitive position, considering the incentives or the discretion of our ASEAN neighbors, even with the reduction also of the corporate income tax rate from 30% to 25%, which is actually, with the 30%, Philippines is the highest in the ASEAN region. So coupled with this very generous incentives and very relevant and targeted incentives, I think that places the Philippines in a very very competitive position to offer for our prospective investors. So well, we have additional incentives of 3 years for those that will this pertains to existing registered projects that will fully relocate outside of NCR. So they are given also additional 3 years. And for those that will locate in areas recovering from disasters like in Marawi or those areas, then additional 2 years of ITH. Next. Some features of CREATE. Okay, this nationality and export bias. So under EO 226, before a foreign-owned business enterprise could register with the BOI and avail of the incentives, it has to be a pioneer project or an exporter, 70% of its total production. But with CREATE, that particular requirement is already repealed. Therefore, a foreign-owned business enterprise can readily register if qualified under the SIPP and avail of incentives, and at the same time supply the local market. So okay, and the next one is for the qualification. No, hold on, I'll go back to the last slide. Okay, some features as well, like Expansion projects could also qualify for incentives under CREATE. The qualification for expansion projects and even the definition for expansion projects would be defined under the SIPP. And as Director Sandy has mentioned, the 2020 IPP basically would serve as the transitional SIPP as approved by the FIRB. Then if you look at the 2020 IPP, there is a definition for expansion there, and with limited incentive. And then for existing registered projects, CREATE also provides for a mechanism for them to register under EO 226, under CREATE, but the qualifications would have to be defined in the SIPP as well, just to make sure that there will be no repetition or no double availment of incentives. Because if the activity is already enjoyed income tax based incentives under its existing registration, then maybe some other incentive it could be entitled under CREATE, provided in the SIPP. Also, for export enterprises, existing projects registered prior to the effectivity of CREATE, they are also they have also the option to reapply under CREATE and avail of another 10 years of the 5% special corporate income tax rate after the 10-year transition periods. Later on, I will also highlight that. But no more extension thereafter, because that was part of the veto message of the president. Hi, next slide. Here, the power of the president. So this is a very generous package under CREATE. This could go up to 40 years of incentive, and 8 years of which would be income tax holiday, and that would be upon the recommendation of the FIRB for highly desirable projects. So the minimum investment capital of 50 billion or at least 10,000 local direct employment. This incentive package could also even provide for financial support, like utilization of government resources such as land use, water appropriation, power provision, budgetary support, and even budgetary support under the Annual General Appropriations Act. So this is one of the highlights also when we try to promote the Philippines to our stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, so here the transitory. So for our existing projects, the question would be what happens to them. The CREATE guarantees that for those that are under the ITH regime, registered with the BOI, for example, you will be allowed to continue availing your income tax holiday incentive based on the existing terms and conditions. And then for those that are under the 5% GIE regime, you will be allowed to continue enjoying the 5% for 10 years. So this is what earlier I mentioned about the export enterprises. So they're given that after this 10-year transition, they can reapply and register under CREATE and avail of another 10 years of the 5% special corporate income tax, subject to the conditions in the SIPP. So those are the things that were highlighted earlier by Director Sandy in her presentation as to the work that they have to do for the SIPP, which we are targeting to be approved before the year ends. So I think I have to already, I think this is the last slide, but just to inform our participants that the BOI is working with the DOF on the finalization of the IRR. We don't want to, while the law provides for 90 days for the Secretaries of Trade and Finance to issue the IRR. There's a question earlier, I saw it. The IPAs will be consulted. That's part of the process. So once we finalize the IRR, the consultation will happen. So in our timeline, we don't want the IRR to be delayed we have, I think in our timeline, we will be able to finalize it in May. So I think Darwin, we are ready to entertain questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Ellie Jean. So, so it's been a very, very interesting set of presentations from our guests from the Board of Investments. We have a number of questions that were already sent in. So with the permission of our guests, so maybe I can already start to ask those questions. So we understand that there was an actually announcement by Secretary Dominguez last week that the DOF nga, as mentioned by Director Ellie Jean, is already in the process of finalizing the implementing rules and regulations for CREATE. And more or less at around the same time, the BIR has already issued revenue regulations implementing the parts of CREATE that are under their jurisdiction. Siguro very generally po, what do you think or what do you expect to be the highlights or the main points of the expected implementing rules and regulations that will impact HIMAP members and the health information management sector of the Philippines? Would you be able to share parang maybe initial thoughts that you guys would have on what the IRR will look like and how that will impact our sector?
Okay. I think later on, Director Sandy can add on because I think the main thing that would impact our HIMAP membership would be the inclusion, the qualification of the activities that they are engaged in under the SIPP. The IRR basically provides for very general conditions on what should be considered in the SIPP. So the qualifications would really be within the SIPP formulation process. So the IRR provides for the general conditions as provided also in CREATE, and which were highlighted by Director Sandy as to the criteria and the conditionalities. But also maybe for the existing ones, and maybe in the operations itself of these activities, when they operate, if there are performance metrics that will be imposed, because the IRR is not really specific to certain sectors. It's generally worded for what should be included in the SIPP and the parameters, the CBA that would have to be employed, etc. So it's really more of that, the process of having it included in the SIPP. And I think with the parameters right now, we have a very big room to really justify inclusion of these activities in the SIPP. And why do we need to incentivize these sectors after so many years already of being qualified in the IPP? Why do we have to continue incentivizing them and encouraging investments? I think it's very timely with the pandemic right now. So those are the things that should be considered in the SIPP formulation itself. The IRR is because we are working, we know the problems that were encountered by our registered enterprises like during the pandemic. So for the part of BOI, we are trying to have these provisions in the IRR where the board or the FIRB could exercise some flexibilities in exceptional circumstances. These are the points that we are continually discussing with the DOF. So I apologize, Darwin, if I can't really tell the specifics of this, but be rest assured that when we are sitting with the DOF, we are bringing all the things that we had, that we have to assist our enterprises to make the ease of doing of business in the Philippines really easy. You know, we have to comply with the EODB parameters. So that's where we are. So, and we have to balance that with the mandate of the DOF is really for revenue and the strict implementation of the incentives, etc. So those are the things. So you can imagine the forces there when we are doing the IRR. Thank you. If Director Sandy has anything to add on that, thank you.
Director Sandy, anything to add po?
Hello, thank you. Nothing to add because we are still doing or identifying the metrics together with the other investment promotion agencies. which also includes PESA, because I noticed one of the comment if PESA is included in the process. Yes, all members of the PIPP, which includes PESA, AFAB, Subi, Clark, even the FAR of IPAs are attending our technical working group meetings, and they are active in the discussions. Thank you. Because they
So
also have their own concerns on the sectors that should be included in the SIPP, but then we have to consider the parameters. So that is one of our difficulties. Thank you.
thank you, po, Director. Actually, we have a number of questions around that. What would be the impact of the implementation of CREATE on PESA zone operators and policies? What would be the direct effect? And I guess following what Director Ellie Jean and Director Sandy have said, I think it's important that we watch for what the IRR will provide, which basically would be an implementation of the provisions of CREATE. Actually, directors, there are two inputs here. It's really more couched as questions, but I understand that it could be premature. For example, there is a question here on, is it possible, or how do we repurpose assets of industries that have been most affected by COVID-19 that presumably would be covered by the CREATE law? So would that be something that is considered by the implementing rules and regulations that are being considered, or even in the drafting of the SIPP? There is also a question that we received on will CREATE allow purely electronic invoicing for enterprises covered? Is that something that perhaps is under discussion? I have not had the chance to review the BIR regulations on CREATE. I'm not sure if that's more their ambit or within the ambit of the BOI. Would you be able to react, Director Ellie Jean or Director Sandy, to that?
For me, on how you can repurpose your assets, I'm not sure if we can advise you on that, because I think that should be a purely business decision. Actually, those activities that we have assisted on those who repurposed their operations, that was the company's own decision. So it can be as diverse from electronics operation, going into PPE manufacturing, or the some is the another company that we have assisted is doing blinds. They are into the selling actually of blinds, but they went into production of coveralls and masks. So it's as diverse as that. I think I think it should be the business should take stock on what are the strengths that are within their company, and to consider if these strengths could be utilized for another business or similar activity. So I think that for me, that is my answer for that. But if that company already has a specific activity for repurposing, then I suggest that if you want to avail of incentives, then I suggest that you try to register that now with the BOI, and because under the interim SIPP or the 2020 IPP, we have the repurposing activity eligible for incentives. I'm not sure if a generic activity such as repurposing will be approved by FIRB under SIPP, because we use SECFITA based on one of the meetings wherein there was a presentation on what activities may be considered for SIPP, and this list of activities can be considered as short already compared to to what we have in the IPP. The comment is still, it's too long, it's too broad. It should be more specific, and the technology should be specified, something like that. So it may be more difficult to to have repurposing in the FIRB. A generic listing of repurposing under the FIRB. So now is the time to register any repurposing activity. So that's my advice and comment.
Okay, thank you, Director. So there's another question.
Okay.
Go ahead po.
No, just on the e-receipt and e-sales that you mentioned about it, or is that correct? Yeah, I think
Yes.
one of the DOF proposals is to include that as a qualification for entitlement to incentives. So it's being considered as part of that as a compliance to the NIRC requirement. I think if I'm not mistaken, section 237 of the NIRC as amended. So that's part, but I think for the part of the BOI, we'll see how, if the system is all go, then I think we can't avoid it. We have to comply with it, but maybe we'll have some description there in the IRR that if it doesn't happen, then there has to be some justifications to it. So we don't know yet, because our tracking is always like that. If it's going to be required as like electronic filing, for example, for ITR, there's still a manual filing. So the same goes with e-receipt or e-sales, I think. So, but just to inform everyone that this one of the proposals of DOF to be part of a qualification for incentives for our registered business enterprise.
Okay. Another question po, and I guess either or both of our guests can comment. Many of our members are actually quite concerned about Section 309, requiring registered business enterprises under specific investment promotion agencies to conduct their registered activities within geographical boundaries of that zone of that IPA. Would you be able to maybe comment on that and provide a bit more clarity or reassurance to the HIMAP members attending today?
I wish I could give you assurance, but my answers are full of disclaimer until we see the IRR. But just to inform everyone that for the part of the BOI, we already proposed, we discussed it extensively, we explained how it worked, and DOF also explained why they have that section that section 309 and create the basis why, the reason why they have that, and that is basically not to target what is being proposed now, because that was pre-pandemic, that the text was pre-pandemic. So what we did is we provided the DOF the explanation why there is a need for a specific carve out for a work from home arrangement during exceptional circumstance. And it's not just a temporary one, because I think the proposal now is to make it a permanent arrangement already. So we provided the text proposal, because we can just simply address it in the SIPP, because it's a very direct prohibition under the create. Therefore, there has to be a very specific exception as well. So that's where we are. We addressed the concern. We provided the text proposal. We don't have any more discussions on this after this, but we will discuss it on Tuesday. So maybe through your officers, we can give some update. I think they are also working with USEC Aldaba and Governor Marge Ramos Samaniego of our office. So yeah, that's all I can share, Darwin.
Yes, thank you po, Director. So another question, and I guess it's something that Roger mentioned at the start. Would you be able to also share with us the impact of the veto messages of the president and how you think that will sort of affect existing registered business enterprises, just so that we can sort of share and begin to anticipate what that will mean for our respective businesses.
Okay, so what we did with the veto message is we tried to see what were removed. No? So prior to the veto, the CREATE that was passed by the BICAM provides for a very straightforward. It says that expansion projects or new projects will be entitled to new set of incentives and the period prescribed under sections 296 and 294. So it means that you have these provisions giving you the incentive and then giving you the exact period, 4 to 7 years, and then 10 years for exporters, and then 4 to 7 years, and then 5 years for domestic enterprises. But with the veto, because what is the subject of the veto is the removal of the new set of incentives and the prescribed period. All right. Therefore, and then it's just what is left is that their availment would be subject to the qualifications under the SIPP. I think the impact for our existing enterprises and even for new projects is that your your incentives entitlement would be really subject to the SIPP. So that's why the work of Director Sandy is very heavy and very challenging, because all of these conditions would have to be placed in the SIPP. So even the types of enhanced deductions that one project, because not everyone can avail of it, it has to be relevant to your activity. Like for example, deduction on power expense, reinvestment allowance for manufacturing industry. Those incentives would be availed by specific sectors that are whose activity is also relevant to such incentive. So those will be provided by again Director Sandy in the SIPP. So I think in terms of impact, and I've also highlighted earlier, Darwin, that the CREATE provides also for this existing enterprises to avail of the incentives or to register under CREATE. But what are their entitlements after? So those will be answered by the SIPP as well. So the existing, at least for those that are still availing of income tax holiday, don't worry, it will be respected. In fact, in our record, we still have until 2036 that will be availing. I think I have one more project that will graduate in 2036 under the existing terms and conditions. So that's I think that's respected to that. For those that are under 5% GIE, they have 10 years. So yeah, those are the things that I'd like to highlight.
Okay. Thank you very much, Director. The other question that we received is around the trends that you see, not just in the SIPP, but also in the global, I guess, the global economic environment. For example, one of the questions we received was that the US is already proposing higher corporate tax rates. And in fact, for example, the Biden administration is already prescribing minimum corporate tax rates for the world. They've also brought up topics like offshore penalties and GILTIs that will actually impact, for example, US companies, US offshore industries. In the context of CREATE, what is your sense, or how does the Philippine government, or in particular the BOI, looking to manage the impact of these kinds of measures abroad that will impact Philippine or businesses that are registered or that are located here in the country? Any sort of trends or plans or ideas that are already in the mind of BOI insofar as, I guess, mitigating the negative consequences of these initiatives from abroad?
I defer to Director Sandy. I was expecting more of a technical questions, but you know, in terms of assumptions, I have to defer to Director Sandy, Darwin.
For me, I'm sorry, but I have no idea how it can affect the industries. What are those offshore, something like that? I'm sorry.
Actually, I think, Director, the question comes from plans by the US government to raise taxes for companies there, and then also to sort of penalize further offshoring of services or economic activity, basically, that could otherwise happen in the US. given what we've done in Create and what we're trying to do with SIPP, how do you see, I guess the other way of phrasing the question is, how do you see yung interplay po na yun? How do you think that those two forces will be coming into play, and how will the BOI, at least in terms of its thinking, anticipate the negative consequences of something like that?
Okay. I think, Darwin, while I was hoping that our promo people will be here to answer that, because in terms of focus as to the industries that we would want to come into the country, maybe the US is not in that part as yet. So in terms of them prohibiting or limiting those activities that could be done in the US, and prohibiting them to going abroad, then I think our target is really looking at by industry. I think Director Sandy can give examples as to, let's say, for manufacturing or for car manufacturing, we have identified several parts of the value chain which we target Chinese companies, or within the ASEAN region, that we're trying to convince to locate in the country. So our promotional efforts hopefully is not really affected by what's going to be the policy of the US in terms of their FDIs, or those of those investments that will go out of US. But our focus now is really within the ASEAN region, because we have identified several industries and very targeted already as to the companies and investments that we would want to bring into the country. That's how our investment promotion now works. So it's not a generic that we go out and then speak and then convince them that we have a very good pool of workers, etc., etc. But that we are already targeting this specific companies and investments that we are convincing, because vis-a-vis the resources that we have, and this developments that we are also trying to do in the other parts of the country, like in the Leyte economic zone. Ma'am Sandy, we have identified several companies that we would want to locate there to be able to have this complete value chain of a certain product, etc. So I'm not sure if I've given you, but the focus now is, I think, this within reach. Yeah, something like.
Okay. So there's also a nice question here. How do you think we in our industry can help ensure that we partner with you in order to sustain or to, I guess, restart the growth of the Philippine economy? How can HIMAP member companies and the industry in general contribute to the work of BOI?
Actually, that should go. I don't know if you have a roadmap already. Do you have a roadmap already? Is there a roadmap for HIMAP? So one way to work together with BOI and the industry and the other government agencies is that to continue implementing and revising the roadmap depending on the situation, when necessary, to improve or to adapt to the changing conditions. So for us, having a roadmap is one way of ensuring that we continue working together, because with a roadmap, it's like a commitment. All parties have this commitment to work towards the goal enshrined in that roadmap. So, and then another aspect also is that you can also help us identify for me, the analytical tools that we can use to assess your industry's compliance with the parameters in the SIPP. If you think that your industry can be categorized as an industry that can contribute significant employment, then what do you think should be the parameter that we can use? Because as of now, we are looking towards a domestic multiplier effect or labor intensity tools. So if you think that will be advantageous to your industry, or you have another economic tool that we should be, you think that another economic tool should be considered by the IPAs, then you can make suggestions. So that's one way of working together. And for industry, and I think one way also of minimizing the impact of what the United States is doing is to ensure that we continue to assist or support the industry with continued inclusion in the IPP or SIPP. So that's one way we can address that. And of course, we need to elevate also in the industry. So we want to have roadmaps for each industry. As what is enshrined in the SIPP and the CREATE law, they want to have innovations. They want to modernize. They want new technology. So how do we improve or enhance the industry? We can work together on that. How do you see yourself in the future after this COVID or with this COVID? How are you going to adapt? So we have to work together on that, because it's the industry's vision of yourself, and the government will only be here to support you achieve that, to support you in achieving that. So
Thank,
that's it. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much, Director Sandy. That was very encouraging to hear po. We have a question coming from the audience. So we would like to call Celeste to actually ask the question directly to our guests this afternoon. Celeste, would you be able
I'm
to
here.
turn on your cam? Yes.
It's on. Yes. Thank you, Darwin. Thank you, Sandy and Elbs, for that presentation. It gives us more clarity on the provisions of SIPP and CREATE. I have a number of questions, but some of them have been answered. But there's one under the powers of the president that I'd like more clarity on. So you said that there's like an investment threshold of 40 billion and then or 10,000 jobs creation. You're very familiar with the BPO industry. 10,000 jobs can be quite easy to achieve. And is there a period by which the 10,000 jobs should be met before this type of activity is elevated to the president and be granted a special set of incentives? Elds? Sandy?
I'm not
Yes. Okay. So go
I
ahead.
see
Ma'am.
Judge po is in a better position.
Okay. Okay, ma'am. So that you correctly pointed out that that's in an or. So it's either a 50 billion investment or employment of 10,000 jobs. Actually, that is within the powers of the FIRB to recommend to the president. Right now, I think that is not yet part of our of the discussions in the IRR, but as to whether the 10,000 should be maintained from day one, or there's a period for the qualified activity to qualify with the 10,000 job. Those things not yet, we haven't discussed it yet in the IRR. So hopefully I will be able to provide you that information by next week once we get to that point in the IRR. But as uh, provided in the CREATE, it's very generic. It doesn't provide for any qualifications, but those are the things that we're going to look at. And just to highlight that it's the FIRB that's going to recommend to the president.
Sige,
Ma'am,
Elds.
so
I think
But if there are ano po, if there are things that you would want to already provide as an information on the industry, I think we have those information, so we can bring that to the discussions in the
yeah.
RRR.
I think that's a window by which more of these BPO companies can still come in, you know, with 10,000 jobs that they can commit right away if they see that there is that window to have a special sort of place in the SIPP, if you can provide the language that can make it more encouraging for BPOs. And therefore it need not be the projects that will be elevated to the president need not be just manufacturing or all of this capital intensive projects, but really the labor intensive projects, and that will include us. So pakitulungan na lang dun sa language. Kumbaga, hinihiling namin is for you to sort of direct an advantage to the BPO with that window. And yung second question, Elds, is again, for the BPO industry, there are a lot of companies that do both voice and non-voice in one operation. And I don't know if this is still the iteration or the version that you have of the SIPP, but we saw an initial version that defines voice operations as under tier 1. And therefore, if tier 1, we know that there's a shorter set of incentives and all that. So for companies that have a combination of both voice and non-voice, I hope that there's going to be a more liberal interpretation for the BPOs, because voice now is a natural component of even complex services, because we try to provide frontline support and back office. So it may not be fair if voice is categorized as, you know, somewhat simple kasi ang magiging understanding dahil nilagay sa tier 1. So if you can just be parang more flexible in that definition for BPO, para hindi naman if your voice, you're just tier 1, parang nadi-discriminate. I'm sure it's not the intent, but really, you know, a better understanding of the industry, so that we are on some sort of an equal footing amongst each other.
Ma'am, I think the reference to the BPO was part of the veto for tier 1. So the specific activities listed in tier 1 and tier 3 in the create were part of the veto. Therefore, the inclusion or the qualification for activities would be based on the presentation of Director Sandy, would be on the descriptions of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So hindi po siya nakatali dun sa what was provided earlier in the create. There's no I think the objective for having those specific activities listed is to make sure that they are already included in the SIPP, but that was part of the veto. So therefore now the Office of Director Sandy will go through the evaluation again as to where to put them based on the description of the tiers. Before Director Sandy, ma'am, just on the I missed the flexibility. I just recalled after I said that it wasn't part discussed, but it was part already of their proposal. One is for the employment generation should be achieved within 3 years from issuance of the CR, of the certificate of registration.
3 years. Okay.
3 years. That's the pending text, but yes, we haven't discussed it as yet because we're still focusing on the other areas like the exemption from work from home, from the locational restriction, etc. Yes, that's the pending proposal. I'll give you to the Director Sandy.
Sige, Sandy, do you have further comments?
Actually, Ma'am Te, for the industry categorization as what was presented earlier, it will depend on whether kasi tier 2 covers those industries or products that are not locally produced
Right.
or not insufficient quantity.
Yeah.
But it was further qualified to be critical to industrial development, if you will recall the presentation. So it's not just simply not locally produced or insufficient quantity. So it should be critical to industrial development. That is for tier 2. And other than that, it should also, there's also the category for tier 2 for import substituting. So those are the criteria for tier 2. And for tier 3, it should be R&D. There is R&D involved, and with significant value added, or it will contribute to higher productivity, or it will involve breakthroughs in science and health, and result in high-paying jobs. Then, or either you will generate new knowledge, and that knowledge will be IP registered, or you will commercialize an already registered patent, industrial design, or copyright, or utility model. And then the activity or the industry is highly technical, manufacturing, or the activity is critical to structural transformation of the economy. So, Ma'am Te, talagang very precise po yung criteria nila for categorization eh. So if you can, kaya nga yung sabi ko kanina, yung innovations ang importante kasi parang yun ang gusto ng create natin eh, to innovate and innovate.
Yeah, we understand, Sandy, and I think we saw, an earlier presentation that will have BPOs in both tier 1 and tier 3, and I'm sure that you'll be open to hearing our position if needed. Pero medyo lang a bigger part of the industry is voice-based, and therefore we'd like them also to be considered in a higher level dahil hindi naman como voice simple lang siya. It's attached to a lot of other things. So yun lang muna for now. Thank you.
Sige, thank you po.
So thank you very much. We actually have a lot of other questions, but we are mindful of the time and we want to make sure that we end exactly at 3:30. So what we will just do is we will collect all of the questions that have been sent over, and then we can share them with our guest speakers for this afternoon. And then if they're able to provide us additional information or answers, then we will share it with the rest of the organization. So with the group's permission, we'll now proceed to our closing remarks. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you one of the board of trustees, a member of the board of trustees of HIMAP, and the managing director of Optum Global Solutions in the Philippines. She has had a long and quite significant career, particularly in our sector. I am part of, full disclosure, UHG and Optum, I am part of, she is a colleague of mine. I have the honor of introducing to you to give the closing remarks, Ivik Mueco. Ivik?
All right, thanks, Darwin. First of all, thank you very much, Director Sandy, Attorney Pertosa, for being with us and spending a great amount of your time educating us, answering the questions, clarifying specific items in the SIPP and the context of CREATE. As I was listening to the interactions, and Celeste, thank you very much for for putting forward also the voice of the BPO voice-based work, right? I think we're fully supportive of everything that the government is doing, and truly realize the context by which this is being pushed, and it's job creation, making sure we incentivize the companies coming in to provide jobs, high value jobs, and ensuring we also spearhead the development outside of the Metro Manila area. I think on our part, that's HIMAP, and under the the overall cover of the IT-BPM industry. There's also a lot that we can do in terms of just the education, right, of how the industry is evolving, especially on the healthcare component. That part of what might happen in the BPO sector as you bring in more of the high value jobs is it's not going to be as many as we bring thousands upon thousands. In our case, over the last 20 years, almost more than 1 million jobs to the Philippines, because the jobs are very specific, very niche, very highly technical. So I think as we look at what the workforce of the future also will look like. So I think this is educational in terms of how we're planning for our future, each of the organizations' future in the Philippines, as we look at the incentives, and also look at exactly where the talent is located and how do they want to work, especially with the experience of COVID in the pandemic. So thank you very much, and to everyone who participated today, and to the HIMAP Secretariat for putting this all together. We truly, truly appreciate the opportunity, and also in the future have the opportunity to set up some time to help perhaps put forward the picture of what's happening in the industry, both in the healthcare industry and the overall IT-BPM industry. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Darwin, and to the HIMAP Board of Trustees. Most of them are here. Thank you very much for all the work done thus far. Thank you very much. And Roger, thanks very much for opening the session today. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ivik. So we have 1 minute left. So I think we've done very good in terms of time. Again, on behalf of HIMAP, our members, our secretariat, our leaders, we would like to thank the guests, our special guests, Directors Ellie Jean and Director Sandy. Thank you. Again, we have events happening next week. Please coordinate with HIMAP. We continue to invite you to participate and to attend all of our events that are planned for the future. Have a pleasant afternoon, everyone. Thank you again. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you rin
Sandy.
po. Thank you. Thank you, Ma'am
Marvin.
Ted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Ingat po
Darwin.
tayong lahat.
Thank you,
Yes,
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Attorney.
Join us next
Thank
week.
you.
Same
Yes.
time.
Thank
1
you.
o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
po.
BOI. Ma'am
Thank
Ted,
you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.